rights movement. And needless to say, this moment probably looks very different to me than it does for you. And I'm not one to privilege my own position, even though I can be dogmatic. And so when we get into the question and answer period, I really want to have a robust discussion about, how you're viewing the moment and how it differs from how I'm viewing the moment. I am so very happy that this is a new moment of activity and movement, social movement. At one point, probably in 2016, I was so depressed at the election of our president, and this is obviously nonpartisan, but I'm keeping it real. I was so depressed that I said to myself, I said, damn, I'm gonna die without seeing this thing that I have been fighting for my entire adult life. The thing that, civil rights, that's kind of like the soundtrack of my life, being born in 61 and having vivid memories of 1968 after Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated. So we'll talk about that. But anyway, let me move forward because, like I said, I'm saying this for those of you all who are just joined. One of my things that I really do need to work on is not trying to fit too much into one presentation. But like I also said, I don't have any restrictions on time, so I'm willing to stay as long as you all are willing to stay. So let me share my screen to get to my PowerPoint. Okay, can you all see that? Yes? Okay, great. Okay, let me start, before I get into a discussion about the civil rights movement, let me start by offering some centering points. And needless to say, you all are here probably because you think differently about politics than the average American. But I will offer these centering points nonetheless. The first centering point is American democracy is a myth. And it goes without saying, at least to me, that we are not who we say we are, okay? And I think that any activist who is worth their weight, if you will, must contend with that fact that American democracy is a myth. We are not who we say we are, and our beliefs about America are largely a mass delusion, okay? When you look at some of our core values in America, freedom, equality, individualism, or I should say professed values, they are largely frustrated by the twin evils of capitalism and racism, okay? It's very difficult to be free without resources. My final centering, is supposed to be centering point, is that voting is not enough. I know this is Chicago Vote, and I know that voting is very important. You will never hear me say that voting is not important. But what I will say is that which my mentor, former professor of mine, Matt Jones, would always say to us, and that is, you can't get revolutionary outcomes from a process that is not revolutionary. Needless to say, voting is institutional, but voting works hand in hand with social movements, okay? You can't get the outcomes you desire without either one, that is voting and social movements. As Frederick Douglass, and I probably find myself quoting Frederick Douglass more often than I would like, but as Frederick Douglass said more than 150 years ago, power concedes nothing without a demand and never will and never have, right? And so we have to be mindful that voting, while important, voting does not mean the same thing to everyone. These two quotes I love by James Baldwin: the vote does not work for a Black American the way it works for a white one, for the despairingly obvious reason that whites in general are welcome to America and Blacks in general are not. And for some of you all who say, oh, wow, I don't see color or whatever, I hope that you could at least contend that most Americans do see color. And for most Americans, race still matters. I also love this quote by James Baldwin on voting. He says that sometimes Blacks will have to vote in order to buy themselves some time. Because while voting does not change the course of Western civilization, certainly there are degrees of madness, right? I don't like a neoliberal Joe Biden, right? But I deplore a fascist and racist Donald Trump, okay? So for me, this election will be to buy myself some time, to position myself to do some things that will bring about a different type of reality in America, okay? So what voting does, it provides a tenuous peace. We go to the polls, we delude ourselves into thinking that after the election results have been tallied, we will see something significantly different than we have the day before election. Needless to say, that is not true, right? I don't care, what you say, but there is no fundamental difference between the Democratic and Republican Party. There are, again, degrees of madness, but it stands to reason, though, that while there's no fundamental difference, it does in fact matter in terms of outcomes. Where are we in this moment? Roughly half of Americans say that Trump has made race relations worse. If you see here, all adults, 48% of Americans say that Trump has made race relations worse. Whites, 42%. That is absolutely amazing that 42% of whites are able to recognize that race relations have been made worse since Donald Trump was elected. The troubling part, however, is that even though most or a significant portion of white Americans are now able to understand that race relations have been made worse by Trump, when you look at the support for Trump in two key battleground states, Pennsylvania and Florida, you will find something really troubling. 49% of whites in Pennsylvania will nonetheless, or have nonetheless, said that they support Donald Trump. And 56% of whites in Florida say that they support Donald Trump. So what you see is some incongruency. When you look at the number or percentage of white Americans who in 2016 said that they strongly support Black Lives Matter, you see here 12% of whites in 2016 said that they support Black Lives Matter. When you look at June 4th to June 10th, whites who had been polled and were asked whether they support Black Lives Matter, that percentage had gone up significantly to 30%. And so although you have more whites recognizing that Trump is, sort of like a purveyor of racist thought and actions in America, and have also pledged some degree of support for Black Lives Matter. I mean, 31% say strongly support, 30% say somewhat support. So that's 61% of whites there. But nonetheless, again, it is a troubling time in America when people recognize a problem, but nonetheless are supportive of a person who is part of the problem. So that's where we are. So let me move on to the civil rights movement. And a lot of these points I'm going to drop rather than push. In other words, I'm hoping that through a more interactive engagement, we will be able to talk more. So I'm just going to drop these points, and then we could sort of push them and unpackage them in the question and answer period. Okay, so what is the civil rights movement? The civil rights movement was a social movement that took place between 1985 and 1968. Most Americans will put the civil rights movement during this period. Now, others will argue that the civil rights movement continues. Obviously, the current reiteration of the civil rights movement is the Black Lives Matter movement, which I see as part and parcel of the trajectory or quest for civil rights for all Americans. So it was a social movement that took place between 1955 and 1968 for equal rights under the law for African Americans and other marginalized groups. And I say other marginalized groups because several movements followed the civil rights movement. But most Americans center the civil rights movement in two specific events. One was the Montgomery bus boycott. And I'm pretty sure that all of you all have heard of the Montgomery bus boycott. It was 1955 in Montgomery, Alabama. You all know the story. Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on the bus on a Thursday, and by the next,
quite nice.
Oh, can someone mute their?
You mute the people, please.
Yeah. So she.
Okay. So the Montgomery bus boycott, Rosa Parks decided she was not going to give up her seat on the bus on a Thursday. And by Monday, the community, many of which who rode the bus daily, had organized a bus boycott that lasted for 13 months. Okay, now that to me is absolutely amazing. From Thursday to Monday, they had organized a bus boycott that 99.9% of Blacks in Montgomery, Alabama participated in. Now, I would like to see in this moment the ability to get 99% of anybody to work toward a particular cause for 13 months. And recall that the Black people in Montgomery, Alabama, they didn't have Facebook, they didn't have Instagram, they didn't have all of these other sort of communication networks that we have today. They had mimeograph machines, but perhaps, and we'll talk about this more later, the one thing that they had that we don't have as much of, and that is organizational capacity. And we'll talk about that again later on. Another sort of pivotal event occurring in 1955 that some people argue was the beginning of the modern day civil rights movement was the murder of Emmett Till. You all obviously, those of you who are so politically astute know about Emmett Till. He was a 14-year-old boy from Chicago, Illinois, visiting his relatives in Money, Mississippi, and he got slaughtered by the owner of a store whose wife indicated that she had been disrespected by 14-year-old Emmett Till. Offshoots of the civil rights movement, as I noted, the civil rights movement was a Black movement, but it was also a movement of all people. When you look at the offshoots of the civil rights movement, you have the women's rights movement of the 1970s, the Chicano movement, American Indian movement, gay rights movement. So, I mean, to say that the civil rights movement, and particularly when you look at the outcomes of the civil rights movement, to say that it was a Black movement is really to miss the point. After African Americans were pressing their cause, that certainly encouraged other groups to do to press their cause as well. What are civil rights? I think that that is important when talking about the civil rights movement, because a lot of people confuse civil rights with civil liberties. Civil liberties are, of course, those rights that are guaranteed you in the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the US Constitution. And what civil liberties are basically protections against government, and particularly against governmental tyranny, right? And civil rights, on the other hand, are protections by government from discrimination by institutions or individuals. What is the definition of a social movement? When we look at the civil rights movement as a social movement, what was it? It was an organized effort on the part of excluded groups to promote or resist change in society that involved non-institutionalized forms of political participation. And this is important because obviously, if institutional processes worked, we would not need a social movement, right? Social movement are organized efforts for those people who are excluded from the routine channels of American politics, and so therefore have to do something extraordinary to get their grievances met. When you look at social movements, typically they use marches, demonstrations, rallies, sit-ins, or violence, because believe it or not, and I know some of you all will beg to differ, but violence is a form of it is a political tool, right? We in America often argue that other nations, other groups other than white people are violent, right? But I really would like to see us redefine violence and not center it in physical violence as much as there are, sort of there is social aspects of violence. I think voter suppression, for example, is violence. I think that food deserts are violence. I think that underfunded schools or lack of health care, that is also violence, right? And so, that is a political tool that have been used against us since time immemorial. All social movements pose a challenge to the status quo or existing institutional arrangements. No social movement is neutral, right? A lot of times people will say, well, I'm kind of neutral. Well, neutrality is only a bias in favor of the status quo. There is no such thing as neutrality. Even if you say that you are neutral, then that means that you support what exists, okay? Tactics of the civil rights movement: marches, sit-ins, nonviolent resistance, social disobedience, public education, legal strategies, boycotts, legislative lobbying. All of these strategies were, as I noted, peaceful and nonviolent, okay? Now, there are some people who argue that, again, that violence is a tactic, and I'm not supporting violence. I don't want you all to leave this presentation saying, oh, Professor Johnson was supporting violence. I don't support violence. I don't condone violence. but I do understand why people utilize violence. Violence is like a key tactic for people who are not being heard, and again, who are shut out of opportunities of mainstream politics. Okay? Now, Pivot and Cloward, one of my favorite books by them is Poor People's Movements, Why They Succeed, How They Fail. One of the case studies that Pivot and Cloward examined in their book is in fact the civil rights movement. And one of the failures that Pivot and Cloward says that the civil rights movement did is to try to challenge the power that the poor have to generate a crisis of political instability. The civil rights movement was, again, a movement that was concerned with nonviolent resistance. And so it attempted to challenge the energies of people who were aggrieved to more acceptable means. Pivot and Cloward would argue that the only thing that the poor has to withhold from, business as usual is their ability to generate a crisis of political instability that forces the elite to adhere to their demands. And that is very important. So I think, what I'm trying to say here is that if you channel all of your energies into processes and practices that don't impact the status quo, that do not create a bit of political instability, then what you'll likely get is the status quo or business as usual. One of my best sources on the civil rights movement is Doug McAdams' book, The Political Process of Black Insurgency. According to Doug McAdams, and I agree with him to a certain degree, on one hand, I indicated that most people put the civil rights movement at that period from 1955 to 1968, and that is just a point to think about in terms of the heyday of the civil rights movement. But as McAdams says, the civil rights movement actually began in 1865 when African Americans were freed from slavery. And he points to 4 broad historical periods of the civil rights movement. That period, 1876 to 1954, the generation of Black insurgency, that period 1955 to 1960, the heyday of the civil rights movement, 1961 to 65, and that is, when many of the gains of the civil rights movement were actually realized or passed. And then finally, 1966 to 1970, the decline of Black insurgency and the civil rights movement. Now, when you look at those broad periods, you can't help but ask, well, if the civil rights movement started in 1865, why wasn't it in any way successful until that period, 1955 to 1968? Well, Doug McAdams notes that there are 3 factors that are important to a social movement and that determines their success or failure. Number 1 is the structure of political opportunities. Typically speaking, the routine channels of American politics allow leaders, if they have, a high approval rate, to do all manner of unconscionable things, right? But in periods of instability, this current moment being one, then there is an opportunity that aggrieved groups typically don't have. When you look at COVID-19 is probably one of the most important impetus for this current moment. People are out of work, people are isolated, people are frustrated, people are angry, people are very attentive to news like they have probably never been. Okay, and so in the midst of this social and economic upheaval, you have, for example, the murder of George Floyd on television for everyone to see. That period of instability, or this period of instability, really creates a political opportunity that is not typically routine. And, given Doug McAdams placing the civil rights movement in 1965, one thing that was really missing for Blacks in 1865 was political opportunity. And political opportunity did not occur really until the 50s. And there are a number of things that occurred in the 50s that really sort of put America center stage. One being like the decolonial movement, okay? And the decolonialization movement in Africa, Central and South America, that really trained a lot of people around the world's eyes on America, because it was like, here is America, this purported purveyor of democracy and opportunity. And then on the nightly news, you see Blacks being sprayed by water hoses with dogs being sicked on them, and Blacks fighting for, such an essential right in a democracy, and that is a right to vote. And so that was a pivotal moment. Here it is, America was trying to spread democracy abroad, and the rest of the world was saying, excuse me? What, I mean, you're talking about democracy when you don't even allow a significant proportion of your citizens to vote, where you're treating people as though they're subhuman, okay? So I think that, that one important factor, the structure of political opportunities, is important. Typically, there is no political opportunity. I think when people look at the civil rights movement or any social movement, they ask themselves, under ordinary circumstances, why don't people rebel? Because there is always a degree of dissatisfaction within the political arena. Black people haven't just got tired. Black people have been tired for a very long time. So what is pivotal about this moment? And again, political opportunity is a key factor. A second factor is the level of organization within the aggrieved population. And McAdams referred to this as a degree of readiness, right? If you have the political opportunity, the question becomes, well, are you ready, right? Because organizations serve as a means of communication, serve as a source of leadership. Organizations serve a necessary function, because the majority of people are not going to, people who are not a part of organizations typically don't get involved in social movements. I hate to tell you this because it is depressing, but the reality is only about 4 to 5% of Americans will ever participate in a protest. Even though, we have seen over the course of the last couple of months, protests occurring, and it looks like, wow, people are out there. Wow, look at this. They're taking over. Actually, it's not a lot of people. It's, 4 to 5% of people will ever protest anything. Ordinarily, there are structures in place that limits people's ability to really lash out when they are aggrieved. And one sort of, vehicle to ensure that people are compliant and complacent is the military, police. If you get a little too crazy, you will be put in your place, right? But again, The level of organization matters because organization determines whether you are ready to really take advantage of your political opportunity. The third factor, the level of insurgent consciousness within the movement's mass base. Um, when I think of this factor, I think of H. Rat Brown, civil rights leader. He used to say, "Free your mind and your ass will follow." Okay, so consciousness, group consciousness matters. Okay, and that's one thing that the civil rights movement, at least during that 1955 to 1968 period, had. It had reached a point of consciousness. Ordinarily, it's very difficult to convince people of anything, right? I mean, you saw how in 2016, only 12 to 14% of whites said that they even supported Black Lives Matter, right? Because most people are not really, I mean, up until recently, you still had the predominance of this argument, all lives matter, or blue lives matter, or this lives matter, totally missing the point. So group consciousness is important within the movement's mass base. And so therefore, rendered the civil rights movement, at least during that period, effective. What were the central goals of the civil rights movement? Institutionalized racial discrimination, ending it, ending political disenfranchisement, and ending racial segregation, or as was constantly discussed, racial integration, right? It was thought that if Black people were in greater proximity to white people, that they would be able to access some of the resources and rights that white people had. Excuse me. The gains of the civil rights movement were plenty. I mean, I can see, even in my own life, I think that my life would be totally different had it not been for the civil rights movement. And I would venture to say each and every one of your lives would be very different had it not been for the civil rights movement. But the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was like one of the primo gains. This is often referred to as a public accommodation bill, because basically it said that Black people had the rights of public accommodation. So anywhere the general public, or that is the white public, could go, white people could go too, whether that was restaurants or theaters or on buses, etc. So the Civil Rights Act outlawed discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, national origin, and later sexual orientation. And all of these, again, this was a domino. The civil rights movement is thought of as the Black movement, but it did impact sexual identity. It did impact gender, equality. And certainly it prohibited not only prohibited discrimination for voter registration, racial segregation in schools and public accommodations, and employment discrimination. A second sort of gain of the civil rights movement was the Voting Rights Act of 1965. What did it do? It prohibited racial discrimination in voting. And another cornerstone was the Civil Rights Act of 1968 that is commonly referred to as the Fair Housing Act of 1968. It's also referred to as the Indian Civil Rights Act, or Native American Civil Rights Act of 1968. But it prohibited discrimination concerning the sale, rental, and financing of housing based on race, religion, national origin, or sex. When you look at some of these gains, I'm pretty sure that you can't help but notice that many of them remain unrealized, right? When you look at voter registration or just voter suppression, right? certainly we're still battling with some of the quests of the civil rights movement. What was a failure of the civil rights movement? There were several. Number one, there was a failure to resolve socioeconomic inequality. One of the things that Dr. King was fond of saying after 1965 was that although African Americans, you know, after the Civil Rights Act of 1964, they could sit at the lunch counter, they may not have the money to be at the lunch counter. So there is a big difference between civil rights and social economic rights. Needless to say, people of color are better off in many ways, but when you look at rights and opportunities in America, they are still very color-coded. I don't care what socioeconomic indicator you care to examine, you will find significant and disproportionate variances by race, okay? I always refer to the unresolved socioeconomic equality as a monopoly game gone wrong. And it goes something like this. We are playing a monopoly game. In the middle of the game, I determine that you have been cheated. You have been cheating, rather. And so I call you out and you're very contrite and you say, okay, I give, let's change the rules of the game. Let's change the policies. Let's pass some legislation. And that is that I will no longer cheat. My bad, I'm sorry, right? And then I say to you, well, let's resume the game. Needless to say, a big problem in resuming the game is that you still have Boardwalk and Park Place, you still have the little green houses, you still have the red hotels. And so every time I roll the dice, I'm gonna land on your property. I'm continually disadvantaged socioeconomically. My kids still go to underfunded schools. I still live in a food desert. I still am the victim disproportionately of police brutality. So I have all these rights, but we left on the table in the interest of a tenuous peace, socioeconomic inequality. We never redistributed property. We never redistributed the spoils of the game. And so we have a situation where, okay, I'm supposed to be free and equal with you, but I don't have any damn money, right? And I'm still being treated very differently. Another failure of the civil rights movement was a tendency to demobilize key constituents. Women. I mean, when you look at sort of establishment Black politics, it was very patriarchal, even though Black women were doing most of the work. Another key constituent that the civil rights movement demobilized was the LGBTQ plus community, okay? Different religious groups. It was largely a Protestant movement. And so it's like, how are you going to be effective when you're demobilizing, your key constituents? And, people also argue that the civil rights movement demobilized people based on class. I mean, basically the civil rights movement offered opportunities for people who were positioned to take advantage of those opportunities, right? But for the vast majority of Black people, it did very little. Another failure was the sort of push from protest to politics. We stopped protesting. I used to work for Reverend Jackson, and Reverend Jackson was always fond of saying that we won every battle that we fought, and we stopped winning battles when we stopped protesting, right? So when you look at that post-68 period, 1968 period, what you see is a tendency to rely on institutionalized politics. And there was a quest for substantive representation. Black people said, well, if we get Black people elected to office, then they will vote in our interests in legislative bodies such as the city council, the state legislature, the US Congress. Well, the problem with relying so heavily on substantive representation is the numbers, right? We don't have the numbers in Congress or any legislative body to pass legislation. So what you find is that it becomes, this quest for institutionalized politics becomes literally co-optation. Now I want to move to the other part, because I want to leave some time for the discussion and some group activities. But before I do that, let me stop sharing my screen so I can see all of your lovely faces, and just ask whether there are a few questions. Come on, don't be shy.
I don't have a question, but I just wanted to say thank you for the presentation. It was very visual.
Say that again.
I said I didn't have a question, but I just wanted to say thank you for the presentation.
Oh, okay. So no questions about the civil rights movement and maybe how it differs from, let's say, our current movement.
I did have a question. Going back to more the first few minutes of when you were speaking and talking about the incongruency in numbers who would vote still for Donald Trump but don't necessarily support his platform. And I'm very much paraphrasing what you said there, but yeah. I'm wondering what you think more of the roots are of those incongruencies, because I grew up very much in the sphere of like white Christian America. So when I hear those statistics, I think of a lot of the people in like the Bible Belt, for example, who see the wrongs in Donald Trump's platform, but just can't support, for example, abortion. And so they become single issue voters, and their single issue is abortion. Do you think, just using that as an example, that could be the reason for some of this incongruency that we see in that support? Yeah,
I agree that religion and other practices have, something to I mean, the anti-abortion opponents certainly play a role or a proportion of that support for Trump. But, and it's true, 79, I was looking at some data, it was like 79% of evangelicals will again vote for Donald Trump. And they say it's because of a right to life and all of that. But I have a problem with that argument, because you will find that those same people who are supporting a right to life will be the same people who will support a death penalty. I think that really at the root of that incongruency is power. I think that there is a difference between putting a sign in your window that say that Black Lives Matter than willing to right the monopoly game gone wrong. And I think that when it comes down to the real nitty gritty, whites don't want to give up power. I mean, they look at it, and I hate to say they, because I'm not looking at whites as individuals, but whites in the collective, right? You look at before George Floyd, I mean, I was just amazed, DePaul and other institutions, they were like, well, okay, after George Floyd, oh my God, now I see the light. We're going to do something about this, right? And I'm like, well, wait a damn minute. What? I mean, where have you been all along, right? And so it's very difficult for me to believe that people who, after the killing of Black people practically weekly, I mean, the visual representation of it, they didn't see the light, but somehow with George Floyd, they see the light. I think that this moment that we have is very fleeting, and that ultimately, you know, the key question that Americans, and particularly white Americans, are going to have to answer is, are they going to rectify the monopoly game that went wrong? Will there be a redistribution of societal resources? Will there be a redistribution to ensure that people have equality of opportunity? And see, that's something that goes beyond the superficial. So I know that's a long answer to your question, but I think, yeah, maybe, you know, a right to life plays a role. But I think, you know, it's hard for me, because I'm gonna tell you, I'm pro-life, but I'm pro-choice. I'm pro-life for me. If I were pregnant, which would be an impossibility at 59, if I were pregnant, I would have a child. But guess what? I'm pro-choice for you. Who the hell am I to tell you you should have a child, right? And so I just cannot see, you know, people who talk about, on one hand, individual rights being so zealous about, you know, your individual right to procreate or not. So I'll just stop there, because I could just go on and on. Because it kind of pisses me off. And I'm not saying anything, again, I'm pro-life, you know, but I think that's a ruse. I mean, if you really have some aversion to racial discrimination, there's no way in the world you could vote for Donald Trump. And again, I'm not trying to make this partisan. I just see it as I see it. I think Fran had her hand raised.
Hi, thank you so much for this presentation. I'm old in the group, but I want to talk about the history of civil rights in America and then ask you a question. We just came back from right before the pandemic hit. We went on a civil rights tour of the South, which was very instructive for my husband, people who felt that we were pretty knowledgeable of American history. And I went to the lynching memorial, learned a lot about Reconstruction, visited a lot of the classic civil rights, sites, the 16th Church, various museums. A simple question is this: there have been laws passed in this country for centuries to try to create equality for African Americans, starting with Reconstruction, which was snipped away thanks to Rutherford B. Hayes and that election in 1877, which allowed Jim Crow to take hold in the South and the federal government.
The Hayes-Tilden Compromise of 1877, yeah.
Right, in a dirty deal, pulled all the groups out. So essentially enslaving Black people again, with leasing and the rest. In the 1960s, there were some very specific things that were being requested. Integration of schools was avoided in much of the South by towns opening private schools and pulling white kids out of public schools. And we got the civil rights passed by Lyndon Johnson, but see, that was in the 1960s. Here we are in 2020, and not much has changed. Certainly not equality of opportunity in education, in job training. So I guess my question, as an old white lady who has seen this year after decade after decade, if you had all the power in the world, what is the first thing would specifically change? Because I think right now, I think we are losing the moment. Black Lives Matter. I don't see anything concrete happening. I think demonstrations great. I think you have to ask for something very specific and frame. We want police to be retrained now, and here's how we want it. Or is this my fantasy of how things are done? Your impression first. What would you change first if you could change anything?
I would change white people's attitudes. I mean, that would be a miracle. You know what I'm saying? That would be like, boom.
Yeah.
I mean, if, and I'm not trying to alienate white people, right? Because people of color don't have the numbers to make this happen, right? But I mean, essentially, I mean, white non-Hispanics are 64% of the US population, right? So in order for anything to happen, whites are gonna have to change their attitudes. I mean, most whites, they do understand that things are different for them. I mean, you have some who say, well, no, I'm colorblind, everybody's colorblind, America's not racist, I have the same opportunities as other people. I mean, you have some people who haven't read anything or haven't done it, you know, who just are just lost. But, you know, most white Americans, they understand that things are not fair for minorities. I mean, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to come to that conclusion, you know, but they're willing to allow it to continue just by kind of tweaking around the edges. You know, okay, well, we'll grant you this, we'll grant you that. And so when you look at institutional processes, passing pieces of legislation really matter little if you're not putting any action behind them. And you rightfully said, Fran, that, I mean, you look at the history of the United States, I mean, we've had so many, when I get to the civil rights movement portion in my African-American politics class, you know, I've already gone through all of the legislation, the court battles, the this, the that, and, you know, then we get to the civil rights movement, and the most pivotal question is, damn, after all of that, why did we even need a civil rights movement? And then you could ask yourself in this movement, in this moment, damn, why do we even need Black Lives Matter? You know, I mean, why would we need a Black Lives Matter movement since we had such a pivotal civil rights movement? And the answer is the hearts and minds of white people. I hate to be like that. I hate to be like that. But I mean, I know it sounds horrible. It sounds almost racist, but the reality is if white people change their hearts and minds today, we would have a different America, okay? But the fact that they don't, again, I think is all about power and the unwillingness to share resources. Again, putting a Black Lives Matter sign in your window or a bumper sticker, you know, yeah, okay, I could say, wow, you're woke. Wow, that's a symbol of your wokeness. But I want to see what you're going to do when it comes to saying, okay, let's take all state resources and not apply them equally, right? Because giving people equal amounts when their needs are not equal is cruelty, right? Let's see what people say when we start talking about equity, right? Now that's another fight. And I don't think that, you know, part of it, the solution is public education. I love community education. I love forums like this because I think it is important to talk to people who do not share your own views, to allow them to test the efficacy of their own arguments and allow you to defend yours, right? But so much of what we experience right now is kind of anti-dialogic. You know, we're not dialoguing with one another. And when we are, it's all about, you know, casting aspersions on people. But yeah, I know that's a long answer to your question.
There was a couple of questions in the chat as well that I want to make sure we don't overlook. So Atlas said, is our current movement less organized? I think you have to know where
this is a question that I have I actually got in an argument last Saturday on the phone with some, you think I'm old, with some old timers, right? Because they'll hold on to, oh, the civil rights movement, we did all this, and oh, we still organized, we didn't make no mistakes. And I'm like, really? You know, are we less organized now? It is just fascinating to me. The reason why I spent a little bit of time talking about the Montgomery bus boycott, because it is amazing to me how we have email, text, cell phone, everybody, I mean, communication. We should be so damn connected that, I mean, it should be amazing how connected we are, right? I mean, because in the civil rights movement, they had nothing. They had the mimeograph machine. And most of you all don't even know what a doggone mimeograph machine is, right? I mean, it was so archaic. I mean, they had typewriters, right? But they were organized. I mean, for the Black community, even the Black church is considered a political organization, because about 80% of Black people in Montgomery, Alabama in 1955 went to church. So they could hear their pastor say, hey, you know, let my people go, you know, tell the story of Moses. And, you know, Martin Luther King is the modern day Moses. And they could speak to one another and say, hey, listen, we are going to do this. 40% of Black people, less than 40% of Black people go to church today. So that, you know, Black church as a political organization, that has been kind of lost. And I tell you, most people just don't join political organizations, and so therefore are not taking part. They are just sort of innocent bystanders watching from the sofa, and they might have a lot of opinions, but they're not in the game, okay? So to that extent, you don't have as critical of a mass as you had during the civil rights movement. And again, I just think that people are willing to, I mean, believe in one thing in theory, but in practice, not let those principles actually govern what they do or what they're willing to fight for. Another question from the chat. Can you read them for me, Alex?
Mm-hmm. I think a thought that I had, you know, off of Are We Organized right now, and I feel like other people can also chime in, is with the defund CPD movement right now, I was like, is there organization behind this right now? You see all the big protests, but there's so much organization behind this defund CPD campaign. I mean, the trainings, they've had a couple trainings right now that have had hundreds of people a part of these trainings, direct action. They have bi-weekly meetings for that anybody can join, and they have, it's just over 100.
I mean, but how many people are coming?
To the meetings or to the
attending, participating? Yeah.
The meeting, I've only been to one, and it was around 125 people. And then we all split up into, you know, different organizing committees. And then from there, I guess it's what people do.
Yeah. And it's about developing that critical mass. And as we'll discuss, maybe this is a good time for me to go back to my screen and talk about some group activities as well as some prerequisites to be a successful organizer. Can I go back? Okay.
Sure.
Where am I?
Yeah, did you have a question? What was your question?
Well, yeah, my question was just, I mean, and it's kind of similar to what we're talking about and even what Atlas was saying, which I was just trying to understand. Do we think that, so post this kind of idea that, okay, maybe now we're not as organized or we don't have the same ways or same, like, I guess, avenues to organize in the same way that we did. What is the reason then? You spoke to how you used to work for Reverend Johnson and how he spoke to how the problem is that we stopped protesting. So, you know what I mean? Like, my question is, I guess, why do you think once the community recognized that just simply getting in the room doesn't seem to be the effectiveness that we thought it was, or simply relying on these new offices and government supports that are supposed to be here to support us are not doing what they're supposed to be doing. Why do you think that protesting still has not come back in the way that it has in the civil rights movement? Maybe, I guess, kind of compared to today.
See, one thing you cannot do is build organizational capacity during the actual movement. You know what I'm saying? And so it's kind of like, when you look at 1865 to 1955, there were different institutions, organizations, I mean, even fraternity, sorority, I mean, all sorts of things that were organizational avenues that were created that could lend its resources to the cause. And I just think that a lot of times what we try to do in this present moment is organize, you know, in a sort of reactive way. That happens, and here we go. Wow, we're going to do this. But we are still disconnected. We're not reaching folk, you know? And so I think that, you know, like we have the tendency to sort of start a new organization. What about working with the grassroots organizations that are in, you know, the indigenous organizations that are in the community? That's one thing that the civil rights movement did. It was not until later that, you know, like the Big Four, you know, the NAACP, SCLC, the Urban League, SNCC, you know, got into the game. You know, mainly when you look at the campaigns of the civil rights movement, that was like working within indigenous groups within various communities. You know what I'm saying? But I think we kind of bypass them. And so we're out here leading a movement without many followers. Okay. Is there another question, or should I move on to the group activity?
I was just interested in your take on the sort of proposals that are going on in terms of like economic policy to achieve equity, like what like Nicole Hannah-Jones is talking about in her recent article on reparations, like whether something like baby bonds or universal basic income or like direct reparations, sort of when, like, how do we do economic intervention the right way? And what are some forms of economic intervention that you think could sort of materialize into like real long-term equity?
Well, for me, I consider myself an education activist, and education is probably like the most important. And I don't necessarily, I've kind of given up on integrated education because history has shown us that the vast majority of people, you know, of white people, and particularly white people who are middle class and affluent, they don't really want their kids going to school with, you know, too many. I mean, you know, I have friends and they say, oh, my school is diverse. You're like, oh, how many Black kids is in your kid's school? And it's like, oh, it's like 2%, you know. How do you define diversity? What is the threshold of something being actually diverse? And so I think that, again, I'm going off on a tangent, but I've kind of given up on school integration. I would just like to see equitable resources so that marginalized kids, not only marginalized, you know, people, kids of color, but also marginalized white poor people can have an opportunity for education. A lot of the things that I support are very class-based. I'm not a proponent of that saying a rising tide lifts all boats, because that's not true. You know, well, it is true to a certain degree, but it does not end inequality. For example, if you look at white versus Black income in 1865, there was a grave, you know, disparity. And if you look at white versus Black socioeconomic disparity now, there is a grave disparity. I don't know whether you all saw that there was a, and I think I have some of the data nearby. I thought I did at least. But, oh yeah, there was an article on last Saturday in the New York Times, and it was contrasting the life chances, the socioeconomic status of people living in the Streeterville community of Chicago with the socioeconomic standing of Black people living in Inglewood. And it noted that there was a 30-year life expectancy gap. I mean, that is really screwed when you think about it. You know, you live in a particular community, and so in your community, there's a 30-year gap in life expectancy. I mean, you living in the same city, that is just like abhorrent, to say the least. Median household income between Inglewood and Streeterville. Streeterville household income, median household income, $103,522 compared to $20,991. Okay. In Streeterville, the median house value, you know, like the value of your house, is $535,000 compared to Inglewood at $115,000. When you consider that the majority of assets that Americans have is like the equity that's in their house, I mean, that really is insightful. And obviously, we know that COVID cases per 1,000 people or 100,000 people in Chicago is vastly different between Streeterville and Inglewood, 11 versus 24 persons contracting COVID. You know, I've talked so much, I forgot the question. Did I answer
it was question? Just about like economic intervention.
Yeah, I believe, you know what, my view about reparations, and I'm really, I hate to come off negative, but I doubt that we will see reparations anytime soon. I probably won't be alive, right? What I think, if I were going to forecast, if I were going to give you all a forecast, and I'm not trying to bum you all out, right? Because I want you all to understand that this is not like a quick fix, right? I have all of my adult life fought for social justice in various realms, right? And obviously, I'm frustrated that at 59, I don't actually see it. But I do think that, you know, just like I always ask my students, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. You know, it is an incremental game. You cannot gulp down a whole elephant, right? And if you've got different people taking a bite out of the elephant, you know, you can consume the elephant quicker. But, you know, I would love to see reparations. I think African Americans, Native Americans, Mexicans are due reparations, right? I think that we need to rectify the monopoly game. I don't want to hear nothing anybody has to say, you know, I mean, when you're talking about being unified when I'm disadvantaged, you know what I'm saying? It's like, that's a tenuous piece. You know, just like when I was in South Africa last, I was telling this white guy, I said, you know, if I were white, I don't think I would sleep well in South Africa, because I had just come from the shanty towns. And I'm like, okay, you know, history would have us to believe that apartheid in South Africa is over, but it's not. Just like apartheid in America is not over, right? And so now, how can you sleep well knowing that at any moment might be a fire keg, something that sparks, you know, and you know, you cannot put the genie back in the bottle. Just like, you know, I am just baffled by people's sort of inability to understand the looting and the violence I'm not condoning, I don't want you all to put me on YouTube saying I condone violence and all of that, or looting, right? But again, people who are marginalized and poor, they have a different relationship to property than I do. They don't give a damn about your property, and you don't give a damn about theirs. You know what I'm saying? So it's like, how can you be aghast or like, oh, why are they looting? I mean, you know why they're looting. They're looting because they don't have anything to lose. I guess the question is, why aren't you looting? If the question were asked of me, I'm not looting because I have a damn job. And at midnight last night, DePaul deposited my paycheck in my account, right? And so I'm privileged. And so I don't see the world like some of the people who are rioting and looting, but I understand very well why they are. Do I condone it? No. But once you understand it, then you can say, you can get at the root questions that are important. The most significant questions is what gives rise to people looting? Not why are they looting? I mean, so you look at circumstances, marginalization. The Congress is arguing whether we should even give another stimulus to people who are very hungry, who don't have anything to lose, right? And you wonder why they're looting and rioting? I mean, I'm just baffled why more people aren't looting and rioting. So a lot of it is economics, but okay, my forecast is that one day America will, there will be reparations. I do believe that. And the question is, at what cost? Right now we're at a point of social upheaval. James Baldwin, one of his books is called Fire Next Time, because that's supposed to kind of be, in other words, it's going to be worse the next time. At some point, if we do not rectify this situation, we will have an outright civil war. Just like the Civil War we had 1861 to 1865, we will have another one, right? And people are armed these days, right? I mean, I tell you, people are crazy, they're desperate, and you got white supremacists, you got some of these neo-Nazi folk. I mean, it's a dangerous time to be alive. So I say, if we don't rectify this situation now, we will rectify it in the future. But I don't think that we're positioned right now to have reparations, even though I definitely believe that Black people are due reparations.
Dr. Johnson, Isaiah, you're raising your hand, and I think Caleb, you had a question in the chat as well.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and just say my question out loud because I want to add a little bit to it. So the question in the chat is essentially, how is the embrace of progressive rhetoric and symbolism, like Nancy Pelosi wearing the kente cloth and these corporations putting out Black Lives Matter statements, how is that kind of affected the potential revolutionary sentiments of white people who are seeing, the horror of George Floyd's murder, just not waking up to how terrible things are for Black people and saying, like, what can we do? And then watching people make these symbolic gestures and maybe, like, I guess, taking a step back and saying, oh, we've done enough. And then I'll also add to this question and say, if Joe Biden does get into office in November, and let's say we have, the Democrats have control of the House, Senate, and the presidency, does their embrace of progressive rhetoric really kind of put pressure on them when they get into office to actually maybe start like a third Reconstruction era of progressive legislation?
Okay, so with regards to the symbolism is just that, symbolism. But I think that even though I abhor it, I mean, nothing enrages me more than that sort of symbolic allyship, particularly among people who I know for a fact, or institutions that I know for a fact really are not committed, but are just, but I, even in spite of that, you mentioned Nancy Pelosi with her kente cloth and all of that. I think that symbolism serves a signaling function, So, most people, and I'm thinking of the guy who said, whose term this is, I can't think of it right now. Most people are like the bewildered herd, okay? Most people are followers, you know? And so when you see people who are popular, famous, saying things, it does have a signaling sort of, I mean, you just look at in the last 4 years, that change in support for Black Lives Matter, I think that it has a signaling effect that, you know, kind of educates people. So I'm not going to just totally, you know, squash symbolism, because it does help. I mean, even if you look at the NFL, now poor Kaepernick, you know, he bent the knee and he was castigated. I mean, what that man went through, he needs some reparations too. He needs to be able to just pick his team and walk on. But it wasn't until Roger Goodell, who doesn't give a damn about any of this, but it wasn't until he said, oh yeah, you know, I mean, for years, people have been talking about renaming the Redskins, the Washington Redskins. But it wasn't until, you know, somebody more famous or economic interest said, you know what, no, we want it changed. I mean, so that does have serve some function, and it's very difficult to not go to the next logical step after you have said, oh, I am interested in dismantling systemic racism. My institution, DePaul University, put out that statement, and I'm like, but you weren't the other day, right? You're interested in, you know, doing it now. So then, you know, you weren't the other day, which is, you know, kind of makes me a little skeptical that you are today. But at the same time, that gives me more leverage. I can hold up your little statement and say, well, wait a minute, you said that you recognized that there was systemic racism and that you were committed to dismantling it. Well, I'm going to add my little 2 cents about what needs to be done. And let's see, you know, how you're going to respond to that. With regards to Biden and Harris, they are neoliberals, right? And so, you know, when you look at the fact that we have a capitalist economy, just like I was saying, that many of the sort of well-cherished values that we have in America, you know, they're frustrated by racism and capitalism, racism and classism. You know, we got a number of isms to contend with. And so I don't think that Joe Biden is going to turn into a democratic socialist. He's not going to turn into Bernie, you know? And if the vast majority of Americans wanted that, then we wouldn't have a Biden Democratic presidential candidate, you know? So obviously we're not ready to go there now. I mean, again, as my mentor, Matt Jones, used to say, you can't get revolutionary outcomes from a process that is not revolutionary. And voting is not revolutionary. It's not going to yield those outcomes until you change American institutions. I mean, in other words, you know, if you want to see something different, if you want to see democratic socialism, then you got to fight for a 3-party system or a multi-party system. Within the guise of a 2-party system, you're going to get this or that. You know, I get to say, okay, Caleb, what do you want? You want what's in my right hand or my left hand? What if you don't want what's in either hand, right? I mean, you want to, I mean, when I look at the debates or politicians talk, they're not saying anything that gets at the heart of the America that I dream of, right? And so, is it going to be significant change? Again, as Baldwin says, you know, Black people vote to buy themselves some time. I mean, it'll just be about degrees of pain, you know, but I'm hoping that you all will do the work to mobilize, organize, and educate in such a way that people are more enlightened. It's a process. Now, I wanted to get at these group activities, but maybe we have already. one of my questions for the group, and this is a question that Keonga Taylor asked in her book, Black Lives Matter to Black Liberation. Can the conditions created by institutional racism be transformed within the existing capitalist order on a mass level and not just for the few? And I think that that's a very good question, because I think that's a question that the civil rights movement failed to ask. You know, they didn't ask about transforming the capitalist order. They asked about Black people getting a piece of the existing pie, right? And so as a result of that, we had a growth of the Black middle class, but you still have classism, right? And so I'll just ask that as a rhetorical question for you all to think about, because we are running out of time and I want to get to the last portion. Another sort of central question regards conquering your myths about American democracy. I had wanted to ask you, what is your strongest belief about American democracy, and whether, when you think about it critically, that belief is true? Can someone share with me one of their strongest beliefs about American democracy? Or I should say, oops, I messed up here. Or I should say, not only about American democracy, but about America, who we actually are. What are some of your strongly held beliefs about who we are? Isaiah?
Yeah, I guess it's one of my strongly held beliefs is that America is made for the white elite class. And then,
oh, well, that's not a myth.
No. I'm sorry. Did you say myths?
Yeah, well, you know, I did say belief, but I'm just saying that.
Oh, okay. I thought you were saying my beliefs.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Okay.
No. You're right. I'm just saying that.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
You know,
yeah.
it's you know, as a matter of fact, the book that I've been working on for too long right now. I always give my students a choice. I say, okay, I want you to name the book, and I have two titles. One of the titles is A White Man's Country, the Unfinished Business of Black Equality, right? And students are like, oh, that's provocative, you know, a white man's country. And then it almost seems like a concession to say that this is a white man's country. But you're right, Isaiah. This country was built for the interests of white property males. And that is a reality that we're still contending with.
For sure. I just wanted to get to the more interesting part of what I think the belief is. It's like it's made for white men, but the under the guise of it's made for white people. So the greatest, I think, myth of America is that the white poor are the same as the white elite, because stuff like interest of class and economic oppression that is by and large the majority of America. You know, we find if they were to awaken to the idea that they are not of the same, power or privilege that the elite are, then we would have a revolution, and we'd have like
a
you
vibrant
said,
class
we'd actually have a struggle that could be interesting or more more deliberate in its motive.
I think the operative phrase that you used was if they would awaken to the idea, right? Because the idea exists, it's a reality. I mean, one of my fantasies, I have several fantasies, but non-sexual fantasies, that's a joke. But one of my fantasies is a vibrant, multiracial class movement. But unfortunately, a multiracial class movement is frustrated by one thing. And what do you think that thing is? Race. I mean, you like you said, okay, white poor people would awaken to the idea. You would think that unemployment, poverty, would kind of awaken them to the idea that, hey, we're not as divided as we are disconnected. I mean, but why don't they? I mean, you're like, seriously? So I mean, I would love to see that. I teach a course on poverty and public policy, and we do an international comparison. Why is it that European nations have much more generous social benefits? It's because they're more homogeneous. You see, as they became more heterogeneous, then you had this sort of worldwide pivot to nationalism, not only on an American scale, because that's what Trump is all about. He's about white nationalism, right? But this is a worldwide phenomenon in the moment. And you're like, why? It is because of increased heterogeneity, And so, but unfortunately, and it is a fact, it's not a speculation, racism frustrates a lot in America. And I am of the ilk that I believe that racism is a mental illness. Just like narcissism is a mental illness, racism is a mental illness because it comprises narcissism, a whole bunch of stuff. You're like, okay, wait a minute. You actually believe that you're better than me because of the amount of melanin in my skin. I mean, that is just ridiculous. I mean, I could show you some dumb Black people, some dumb white people, some dumb Mexican. I mean, it's like to even believe in 2020 that there is a racial hierarchy or subspecies of the human race is really insanity, right? But I think that, one thing that we don't talk enough about is power. White people, even when they're poor and hungry, they don't want to give up that psychological privilege of being white. It's bad. It's hard to understand, but it's true. Okay, so I really interrupted Isaiah too much, but I mean, can you think of some like well-cherished beliefs? Because I think that part of the problem, you've heard of cognitive dissonance, and I think part of the problem is that we are raised from point A, that America is exceptional, America is equal, America is all of that, America is wonderful, America, America, America. And even though it contrasts greatly to what we see, we still hold on to that cherished belief, right? And so, I mean, I think until you travel internationally, you might just hold on to the idea that America is the best country in the world. I think that there is this cognitive dissonance that makes us hold on to these well-cherished beliefs, even if we see something vastly different. You want to believe that America is for everyone and equal and everybody has an opportunity. I'm sorry, Alex.
I was just saying, I know Kia put one in the chat. Do you want to say it, Kia?
Yeah, sure. I was just saying, like, I feel like two things that I was like a belief that I had coming up was that my vote matters, right? That's a belief that I feel that I was taught, right? Mm-hmm. As well as that my American citizenship is not only a worldwide, like an international privilege, but it's something that the rest of the world wants to covet. It's something that people aspire to or put on a pedestal, that American citizenship is like a gold standard.
Mm-hmm. And so what is your, I mean, do you think that that's true? Both of those are true?
I mean, I think that I'm in a place where I do believe that my vote matters, but I definitely had to kind of unlearn so much of my original idea of what that meant, right? I don't think my vote matters in the same way that I probably used to think of it as a kid. Mm-hmm. And I think about, what you spoke to in the beginning of this, of how voting is not one and done. It's not the end of your process. It's not the end of you doing your civic duty. And that's something that I had to kind of learn, right, later on, or unlearn. With citizenship, it's hard because I recognize that so much of the narratives around, like, you know, it being so valuable or it being something that everybody wants, like so much of that is propaganda. But I mean, it is still a major privilege. You know, we are like kind of this like worldwide power, but I don't think of it as the same. I also recognize that it doesn't have the same privileges that or kind of actual privileges, like things that you can use in your regular life. In a lot of ways, you know what I mean? I think of, I'm thinking specifically just of my perspective of being first generation, right? Being a citizen, being the only citizen in my household and how that presented itself. But I mean, it's not really, you know, a major privilege. I can't go around and wave my passport in somebody's face today and expect anything, you know, if I go to Starbucks or something.
Yeah, I agree that voting matters and is a privilege, and citizenship is also, it also matters and is a privilege, but not equally, right? If you are from, as Trump would say, some of those shithole nations, you know, I didn't say, that's not my word, that's his word. You know, your acquiring American citizenship may not really matter as much from somebody acquiring American citizenship from more, you know, white nations, right? So yeah, citizenship certainly matters, but you know, you have a lot of Mexican people who are citizens, second, third generation. And well, you remember, you know, Mexico was the United States. I mean, you know, what is now the United States was in fact Mexico. So, I mean, but nonetheless, I've heard people say that as a Mexican citizen, they have been harassed and harangued. You know, people are like, okay, questioning their citizenship. I mean, even the first Black president, I mean, there were questions about his citizenship, you know? So had he been white, there would not have been any questions about his citizenship, you know? So I think citizenship matters, and certainly voting matters. But when you look at the heavy influence of money in American elections, you know, just like one of my former professors used to say, votes count, but resources decide, right? Votes do count. Nobody can tell you that votes don't count, right? But resources decide. When you, I mean, that money, I mean, again, we don't have a socialist economy. You know, most Americans, even though they don't know how to define socialism, they are fearful of socialism. So we're not there yet where we could even think about it. But, you know, I think I commend Bernie, and just getting back to Caleb's point about symbolism. I think it was Caleb, you know, Bernie Sanders, you know, I don't care what you say about Bernie Sanders. I mean, I love the man. He kicked the ball, you know, up the road significantly, because at least he has people wondering what the hell is democratic socialism, or even contemplating, you know, the you know, the possibilities, you know, and it begins with a vision. And so, yeah, so voting matters, but it depends on, you know, who you are and the resources that you have, and certainly citizenship matters. Okay, so let's, I'm gonna go back to share screen, because I had a final part, and that is about, if I could get back here. Prerequisites for success in the field. I mean, you know, you all are our hope. You all are really our only hope. Well, not our only hope, but, you know, a lot of what happens in the future is predicated upon people like yourselves. What are some prerequisites for success in the field? And I kind of changed the question that Alex gave me. She asked, the question she asked me to address was key skills, but so I changed it to prerequisites. Courage to confront the status quo, and that may not sound like that being that's very important or should even be said, but it takes a lot of courage to confront the status quo in your family, in your friends, friend network, you know, in the world, because the majority obviously don't think the way that you think about these issues. If they did, there would be no need for, you know, a movement, you know, for social justice. So just the ability to confront the status quo is a prerequisite. You have to be able to say, you know what, we want something different. Willingness to critique the system as it is and not how you want it to be. I get so sick of people saying, well, if you're not satisfied with America, leave it. As far as I'm concerned, I'm like America's biggest patriot, right? I want us to live up to our principles and values, but you know, living up to those principles and values at this moment is aspirational. It is not a given. Another prerequisite for success in the field is resisting the savior complex. Many of us, I would venture to say all of us on this Zoom call, are, you know, we have various privileges. And so we think that we know it all and that, you know, we have all the answers. And I think it's important to work within existing indigenous networks and to ensure that there's democracy in our own organizations. You know, often in some of the civil rights organizations, they were the, you know, most sexist and homophobic, you know, so there has to be democracy in our own organizations. Another prerequisite is resisting the tendency to normalize your own American experience. And that kind of goes with resisting the savior complex. You know, I always say that, you know, who we are as a country is defined by those who are privileged by its policies and practices. You know, so when you hear people say, you know, like, oh, that's not who we are, right? Well, who we are, the reason why there's a contrast between who we are and who we say we are is because the story about who we are is told by people who benefit and are privileged within the confines of the policies and practices. And so, you can't privilege your own experience. You have to understand that there are many Americas. I'm reminded of Frederick Douglass's speech, "What to the slave is the 4th of July," right? You know, it's kind of like, you know, you can celebrate a certain aspect of America, but who does that relate to? We have to be cognizant of that. Another is moving beyond the narrow confines of diversity. I always say diversity without inclusion is cruelty. Just having people, you know, within your midst, but not giving them the power and opportunity to do anything, I think that's cruelty. So it has to go beyond diversity. And then finally, a prerequisite is patience to understand that the battle is long-term and incremental. It's not revolutionary. The only time you're going to get revolutionary outcomes is if you actually have a revolution. And that is something that I, just based on my limited lens, doesn't look like we're ready for. And so with that, you know, let's move to more discussion and question and answers if we have any.
I think we probably have time for like one or two more.
You know, in groups like this, and I alluded to this before, you know, I think that we have to dialogue more with one another and test the efficacy of our arguments. You know, my favorite classes, because I teach, all my classes have some aspect of race and class, right? I like it when there are differing opinions. I don't want to be in an echo chamber. You know, I don't want to be in a situation, I don't like presentations where people are not courageous enough to, you know, be provocative, you know, and ask that question that they wanted to ask, but just didn't want to be poo-pooed on, you know? So are there any questions like that? I mean, I'm talking about questions like, why are Black people so concerned with police on Black brutality when there's Black on Black brutality? What about, you know, the response, huh?
That question in this group, Valerie, I think you're probably
okay, wrong group.
all
Okay.
classes.
Okay.
So I see where you get those.
I mean, because you know.
But maybe, who knows? I'm not sure. I haven't met everyone.
I mean, because that, I mean, but you know, I've been asked that question, you know, before.
Sure you have.
I mean, not this type of audience, but in class, and when I've given presentations, you know, it's like, well, maybe if Black people would just, you know, do the right things and not kill each other, maybe their communities will be different.
Isaiah, you have something to add?
Yeah, this is my question from earlier, which is, so you kind of seems like critique our current movement, and specifically how it is organized. I know that there are some varying opinions among folks here, but what is your thoughts on like the decentralization of current movements, especially in the last 10 to 15 years, in relation, in juxtaposed to like what we've seen in the past and how movements have been primarily based on leaders or institutions, and now it is kind of widespread. And if you can speak to the internet.
Well, you know what? Okay,
well.
My critique of the Black Lives Matter movement, I give them 150% if I were going to grade them, right? It's not like the civil rights movement. I think it's a lot better, right? Because it's not sexist, it's not homophobic, it's more global, you know, so I love that. I think that's great. But I just wonder about the sustainability beyond the moment and whether we're getting so caught up on, you know, sort of certain reforms without really going to the marrow, you know, the bone and marrow of this thing. You know, okay, let's say you reform the police department. I don't think that you're going to get police to stop killing people of color disproportionately until you sort of change the discourse on race in America in general. You know, so it's like, yeah, I want some police reforms, but you know, I mean, we've had some police reforms, but they don't stick because there's still this susceptibility. I mean, you know, Black lives are not as valued as white lives. I marvel at the beginning of my race courses. I always ask my students, which group is most valued in American society? Which racial group? And I tell you, I've never had one student to argue that it wasn't white people, right? And so, I mean, students always say, I mean, it's like, yeah, everybody knows that white people are more valued in American society. I don't care from whether you're talking about, you know, just concepts of beauty, what's beautiful, what's smart, you know, what's, you know, whiteness is valued in our society. But, you know, it's like, if you're not kind of like digging into that, just like that, the racism that is in our DNA, and if you're not getting to the heart of structural inequality and demanding different institutions, then, you know, I just wonder about the sustainability or outcome. And it may be just like the civil rights movement, you know, the Black Lives Matter movement will take a bite out of the elephant, and then some other iteration will take another bite out of the elephant, and the elephant will be consumed. I don't know.
Yeah, maybe one more thought or provocative question to get Professor Johnson's blood boiling a little bit.
But you know, I think that we, and maybe that's something, you know, that goes along with not normalizing our own experience, because even if we're Black or brown, you know, we may have a tendency to normalize our experience. Maybe we are not racist, but we could be classist, we could be homophobic. I mean, you know, I just think that we have to get beyond ourselves to understand that life is different for different people in America.
Can I?
Please, Christine.
Hi. The comment that you made much earlier when you were talking about when somebody asked you if you could have anything you wanted, and you talked about having white people change their attitudes, I echo that. I'm agreeing with you, which is maybe not what you're looking for in this moment, but you know, I have a mixed race son, and I grew up as a white woman in a racist world. And, you know, I've known for, I don't know, I've had at least some awareness since I was in my mid-30s. I'm a little bit older than you now, that I live in a different America than Black people live in. And honestly, it wasn't until, well, it was all the killings, all the, you know, all the publicized killings and stuff, and then George Floyd, that caused me to dive into reading and learning. And you know, you said something earlier about, I suppose what I want to say is, like, I can't underestimate what I perceive to be the magnitude of the problem with the history we've been taught, which is white people history. You know, there just isn't enough information about, you know, and maybe I heard about Rosewood, or maybe I heard about Tulsa, but then, you know, I'm reading another book that talks about, you know, violence against Black folks trying to vote in Louisiana, and a massacre. And so I go Googling to try to find the name of the massacre, and 3 come up. And I just don't know the history of Black people in America. And so even folks who I think, and this is just my experience trying to talk to people I know, people who are sympathetic, people who are on, you know, if there are sides to be taken, people who are on the side I'm on, that we just don't understand.
Yeah, so, and Christine, unfortunately, not only do a lot of white people not understand, but a lot of people of color don't understand either. You know, we all are subject to the same frames, right? And we have all bought into white supremacy to a degree. And it you know, our education, I mean, that's why I talk about cognitive dissonance. You know, a lot of people think, well, wait a minute, we are free, we are good. You know, I've even had students who say, well, if America is a racist country, how is it that you're a professor at a predominantly white institution? Well, there's, you know, the system makes accommodation for including a few, but not all, you know. But I think it begins with the recognition. That's why I say, you know, we shouldn't privilege our own experiences. It begins with the true dialogue, begins with the understanding and recognition that I don't know. You know, that's where learning really takes place, when I say, you know, I don't know. But for some reason, you know, just like I've become fond of contrasting the typical response that is elicited by, let's say, a person who is differently abled saying, I don't have access, than a Black person saying, I don't have access. The latter engenders a more defensive response. You know, if a person who is differently able said, you know what, there's no ramp, you know, for me to get in the building, nobody, you know, you'd have to be a real weirdo in American society to get defensive about that. but it's something about race, and we know it. We've read it in our history that it just it's like a visceral reaction. People get defensive, so much so that, I mean, you just like you as the mother of a multiracial child, I'm reminded of that film Cracking the Codes, where this Black woman who is a mother of a biracial child talks about how her husband was really had a problem with the son taking up for himself, defending himself. The kids were picking at him, they were beating him up, and her solution was kick their ass. And he was like, no, he can't fight back. And then when they unpackaged it, they came to an understanding that as a white male, he didn't want his biracial son to be perceived as the Black male thug. You know, so even in his, I mean, this is his son, but even in his mind, you know, he's like, no, I want him to be a nice guy, and I want him to be, you know, so this is just so, I mean, the layers of it just didn't begin now. I mean, peeling that onion is going to take persistence and patience too. And I'm not counseling that, you know, we just give people a pass. I think it's important to confront isms where they exist, but, you know, at least allowing people to be ignorant. You know what I'm saying? I mean, to say, well, you know what, you're right. You know, the history of the hunt is told not by the lion, but the hunter. And so we're going to have to revise the history, you know? I mean, just like you see this movement to, you know, tear down the monuments, you know, I have a real problem as an African-American woman when I go to the park and all the damn statues are of white men. You know, I really do. And I think that has, just like your Black son, he will, I don't know whether he's Black, I'm sorry.
He is.
Okay. Your Black son, I mean, just imagine the sort of nonverbal message that gives you, you know, when everybody who is somebody is white. Mm-hmm. You know, nobody has to say to him, you're inferior because you're Black. I mean, the messages, the nonverbal cues are there, you know, they are there.
And on that note, as we take down these statues one by one, can everyone give just a big thank you to Dr. Johnson for being here and just spreading so much knowledge.
Thank you
so much. Appreciate you.
Thanks, Dr. Johnson.
Okay. Okay, Kia, I'll see you on another Zoom when you're available.
How can we get office hours with you if we don't go to DePaul?
Well, you can always shoot me an email. My email address is very easy. It's Valerie, VALERIE.C, middle initial C, .johnson@depaul.edu. I'll write it I guess I should write it in the chat. And, you know, we could communicate. We could have another session. Just let me know.
Perfect. Thank you.
When we had our check-in for this first training, Dr. Johnson already said that she needs to reserve a part 2 to this discussion.
Yeah, when I was talking to Brian and Alex, I'm like, hour and a half, I don't know.
We went for 2 hours because it was not enough.
Yeah.
Well, thank you.
Okay, well, I appreciate you all, and just continue to fight the power.
And this video will be available because we have it recorded. So thank you again, Dr. Johnson. We'll make sure you get a copy of it.
Okay.
Everyone that came, please, yes, hit up Dr. Johnson. Her email is in the chat.
Okay. You all take care. Have a great weekend.
Thank you, Dr. Johnson.
Okay.
We love you.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
You said, okay, bye.
Well, we don't really have to go on to the other one, I